All right. Good evening. Thank you for joining. Tonight's class, of course, is in honor and the merit of all the Jewish people, wherever they may be. They should be secure, especially those in the land of Israel, especially those in the front lines, and those who are being held captive. They should be released immediately. And if you would like to sponsor a class, sponsorship opportunities are available. You can send us a message or leave a comment. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you. Okay. Let's get started. So, this week's Torah portion, in addition to the Torah portion, we read a special section called the Parshat Shkalim, which is actually last week's Torah portion. We'll talk about that in a second. And this is the first of four, they're called the four Parshios, the four special Torah portions that are read in connection to Purim and Pesach. And so for starting with the Shabbat before, or the Shabbat that starts with Rosh Chodesh Adar, the first of the month of Adar, in this case Adar 2, because that's the Adar that has the Purim in it. And then we also have Parsha Zachor, which is the Parsha that we remember. We read an extra section that we remember Amalek, that who in connection to Purim, because Purim is we read about Haman, who was a descendant of Amalek, who tried to destroy the Jewish people. So we read that on the Shabbat before Purim, and then on the Shabbat before Nisan, we read Parshas HaChodesh and Parshas Para. We read in connection to the month of Nisan, which is about the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, which the first month is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and of course Parshas Para is connected to the idea of the red heifer, that we read about the mitzvah of purification before one goes into the holy temple. If someone is impure from a dead body, it has to get sprinkled by the ashes of the red heifer, and that is something that was done also around this time of year because of the proximity to Passover, and all the Jewish people have to bring a Passover offering, so therefore everybody has to be ritually pure. So getting back to our Torah portion in Parsha Shkalim. So there's a mitzvah to give a half shekel. This mitzvah applies in all times of when there's a temple around the month of Adar, which is why we read it now. Around the month of Adar, they would start to announce that everyone has to give their half shekel, which is approximately 8 grams of silver, which I did check. Today's value, like today is in today, not like this era, but today, it's approximately 75 cents a gram, so it's about $7, give or take, worth, and everybody has to give it. Kohen, Levi, regular Jew, a slave, women, everybody has to give it, and they would use the money. They would purchase the offerings that were given in the temple in the month of Nisan. So that's why it was the announcement was given in Adar. And this was something that happened every year in the times of the temple. Even those who were outside the land of Israel were also obligated to give this. So in order to remember this, even though we don't have a temple, we don't have this obligation, we remember this by reading this Torah portion. The entire Shabbat is therefore called Shabbat Shkalim, the Shabbos that we read the Torah portion, the special Torah portion of Shkalim. Now, another reason is because why specifically this mitzvah, not other mitzvahs that we read about, is because when Mashiach comes, we're going to have to know how to do it. Another reason is that because it was something that was equal amongst all the Jewish people, is something extra special. So that's why we specifically read about this mitzvah. So how does it work? What do we read? We read actually the beginning of Parshas Kisisa, which was last week's Torah portion. We read the beginning, which talks about this mitzvah that Moses says. That God says to Moses. This is in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16. When you count the sum of the children of Israel according to their numbers, let each one give to God an atonement for his soul when they are counted. Then there will be no plague among them when they are counted. This they shall give. Everyone who goes through the counting, half a shekel according to the holy shekel. 20 geras equals 1 shekel. Half of such a shekel shall be offered to God. Okay, and verses continue about how you do it. So we see that this is how the Jewish people were counted. God tells Moses to take a census, specifically through everybody giving a half a shekel. And eventually, this original half shekel that we read about in Parsha Kisisa was melted down. The silver coins, and were melted down, and were used to make the sockets for the tabernacle, for the Mishkan, and all the wooden pillars were put into these sockets. So these sockets were made of the silver from this original census. And the Torah tells us, why is this done at this time? Why is the census specifically taken through this counting of the coins? If anybody who's, we have a census, I believe in the United States, we do a census every 10 years. You just write on a card and you send it in the mail or on a computer. I'm not sure how they do it these days. And you write, there's 5 people in my family, there's 7 people in my family, there's one person in my household, and you mail it in, and that's how they count the census. But the Torah tells us, if you were to count, it will be a plague. So, and we'll see how that actually happened in Jewish history. That the Torah tells us that there's a specific thing that the Jewish people should not be counted directly, but rather be counted through some sort of object or other ways, as we'll see soon. So, how does this work exactly? So, in the Talmud, we have a story. We have a few stories, and the Talmud goes to explain this prohibition of counting the Jewish people directly and not using some sort of other object, like we see in this Torah portion that we're reading. So, the Talmud tells us that we see in Samuel. I think it was. Let's see. The first one is in Samuel. Let's see. I don't have the exact verse, but it's in the book of Samuel. And the book of Samuel discusses that King Saul was chasing King David. There was a period of time where King Saul was chasing King David. That King David, because of actually related to the Amalek battle that happened, right? That God says that tells Samuel to tell Saul that the kingship has been removed from him, is going to be given to David, and it is going to be, and he is going to be the successor and won't be his own son. And that's a very long story, but they chase each other, and there's all kinds of things going on. So in one of the situations that happens, what happened was Saul closed in on David's hiding place, and David knew that Saul was close. So what does he do? He steals. He sneaks into the camp of Saul, and he steals his arrows and his water. And eventually, he makes his way to the top of a hill, and he starts this dialogue with Saul. And he says in the verse that, if God incited you against me, David tells King Saul, I will pray that he turns your negative plan to good. So, being that King David was who he was judged harshly in this matter, something that seemed seemingly so benign, but because he said that God incited him, even though he wasn't really saying that God incited, he said, if God incited him, that God punished David for this, and he said, I'm going to make you make an error in something that even school children know, which is, what do school children know? They know the verse that says that you shall not let the Jewish people be counted directly, but they should be counted through another item, a census through coins or the like. So the Talmud tells us, what does it mean? How do we know? How do we know this idea that Saul? I'm sorry. How do we know that it is forbidden to count the Jewish people directly? We'll see in 1 second that there's 2 verses in the book of Samuel that teach us this. Okay, before we get to that, let's continue with the rest of the story of King David. It happened also in the book of Samuel that King David tells his Yoav, who was his in charge of his army, tells him to take a census, and he takes the census, and because again he counted them directly, he did not tell them to take a census through some sort of object. or the like. He counts them and he says that he has 800. He presents the sum to King David. Yoav says Israel consisted of 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. So that's the census. And then later in the end of that chapter 24 in Samuel 2, God sends a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, from Dan to Beersheba. 70,000 people died. So we see here the fulfillment of this idea that there will be a plague. 70,000 people die. King David begs for mercy, and he says, what did they do wrong? I'm the one who made this mistake. And God tells him to go to the threshing floor in of Arnava, the Arvana, the Jebusite, that is the place where the temple is eventually erected. So in other words, God tells David, in order to rectify this, he should go build a temple. So that is the story of David's mistake, and he was punished for making this mistake, and that this plague happens. So the Talmud tells us, how do we know this idea that a person, that you should count the Jewish people indirectly, not through some other object. So the Talmud tells us two stories about King Saul. The first one says in Samuel 1, chapter 11, that they're supposed to make a treaty with Nachash the Ammonite, and they say that the only way we're going to make a treaty is if I gouge out the right eye of every person. So obviously they come to Saul, they beg him, and Saul says, okay, I'm going to take a census in order to figure out what our military options are. And it says, Vayifkedeim babazak, and he counted them in Bezek. And the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. Okay? So the Talmud says that we see here, what is Bezek? Bezek means, the Talmud says, Bezek means that he counted them with shards. The word Bezek comes from the word, similar to the word shards, that everybody took out a shard, or some say that it means stones, and they all put down a shard or a stone, and that's how they took the census. So he would know what his military capabilities were and what his military options are. And the Talmud says, Rav Ashi specifically, which we mention if you follow our history personalities that we do on Tuesdays, we talked about Rav Ashi this week, so it's apropos. And he says maybe it means that he counted them in a place called Bezek. That was the name of the town where he counted them. So the rabbis give another verse, another proof to this idea that you have to count indirectly. And they say that it says in Samuel 15, verses 1 through 4, when King Saul is going to war against Amalek, and he does another census. It says, Vayifkedeim betelaim, and he counts them with sheep. Okay, and he counts 200,000 footmen and 10,000 the men of Judah. So we see here that he counted them with sheep, that everybody brought a sheep, and he counted the sheep because we see from here that is clearly not permissible to count the Jewish people directly. So the $1 million question is that we just talked about this whole idea that this is clearly from Parsha's Kisisa, which we read in this week's Torah portion in Exodus. I'm sorry, not in this week's Torah portion, last week's Torah portion, in this week's Parsha Shkalim, and we're going to read that that Moses was instructed to count the Jewish people with these coins. So seemingly, why would the Talmud have to tell us? No, we see that King Saul, that whether it was in this time when he was making this when he had this, that when the people came to him and asked him for protection, that he counted them with these shards, or whether it's that he counted them with a sheep. Seemingly, they should have just, the Talmud should have just said, it's in Parsha's Kisisa, it's a verse. And not only that, why was King David, if you're going to say that it was something that is in Exodus, something that the Torah tells us you're not allowed to do, it makes a lot of sense why King David was punished. Versus if you say that it's something that King Saul interpreted through his Beis Din, his court, that his court said that this is how it has to be done. If that's the case, then King David has every right, as a contemporary of King Saul, has every right to interpret the law differently. So why would King David be punished for something that was a ruling of King Saul? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It would make much more sense to say this is something that we find in the book of Exodus, something that is in Torah, not just something that is from the prophets. So the question is, why does the Talmud focus on these verses in the book of Samuel? So the answer given by many of the Tosafists and other commentaries on the Talmud explain that the difference is whether this is a mitzvah counting or a non-mitzvah counting. So let's take a step back. What does it mean, a mitzvah counting or a non-mitzvah counting? When Moses was told to count, there was no reason to count the Jewish people. Moses wanted to count the Jewish people, or God wanted Moses to count the Jewish people, however you want to look at it. And therefore, why did he want to count them? We'll get to in a second why he wanted to count them. But because he wanted to count them, therefore he was told to do it in this special way with the coins. Versus in the times of King Saul, these were mitzvah countings. He had to count them because there was a mitzvah, a commandment to battle these. Whether it was this situation of protecting the Jewish people, which is a mitzvah war. There are certain wars that are considered a mitzvah. This is not just to gain territory, but to secure life. In that case, or in the case of the Amalekites, where Saul was fulfilling a biblical commandment to destroy and wipe out Amalek for the fact that they were completely evil and wanted to destroy the Jewish people. So either way, these are mitzvah wars, and therefore he had to know what his options militarily were. Therefore, he had to take a census, and maybe we could say that in such a situation, there is no obligation to do any of these kind of things where you count people indirectly. And perhaps in that situation, he was allowed to count them directly. So therefore, the Talmud wanted to show us, and by the way, in the case of King David also, right? King David wanted to do it for his military. He wanted to know what his military options were, and what his military wanted to do, what their capabilities were, I should say, and therefore, perhaps he wouldn't be liable. Therefore, the Talmud used these stories of King Saul to prove that this prohibition applies as well in a scenario where the census itself is a mitzvah. Okay, so just to again, we see that in the case of Moses, there was not an obligation to take the census. In the case of Saul, there was an obligation to take a census. And nonetheless, there was still an obligation to make sure that we do not count the Jewish people directly. Okay, whether it be through stones or shards or through sheep, or in the case of Moses, through coins. So now that we understand that, we understand why the Talmud had to bring these stories specifically about King Saul, and they cannot reference directly the book of Exodus and the Parsha of Shemos. So why did Moses carry out the census? Right. So we just explained that Moses' census was not an obligation, and not only that, God tells Moses, if you make a mistake and you count the Jewish people directly, as it says in this, and it says in Exodus, there could be a plague potentially. So if there could be a plague, why would Moses take such a risk to count the Jewish people when this is something that could lead to something negative, as we see that actually happened in the story of King David? So we know that in Jewish history, the Jewish people were counted many times. And the reason it's always brought to why the Jewish people are counted because it shows their preciousness, that when we have something that's important to us, we count it. And therefore, it shows on the preciousness of the Jewish people. And Moses wanted to show the Jewish people that after the sin of the golden calf and everything they had been to, Moses wanted to show God, so to speak, that the Jewish people were so important and so precious, and therefore he counts them again. And of course, he's even willing to do something that's potentially risky, and God tells him how to make sure that nothing bad happens, and to use coins, or in the case of Saul, other objects to make sure the Jewish people are not harmed. Now, practically, how does this affect us today? So there are many things that today in Jewish law that require certain amounts of Jewish people. So the classic idea is that whenever there's a minyan, whenever there is something holy that we want to say, like Kedusha or Baruch Hu and the prayer services, or a Kaddish, in the prayer services, we need 10 Jewish men. So how do you know if you have 10 men if you can't count them? So let's look at the code of Jewish law about how you do this. So if you go to Maimonides, he describes how this was done in the temple in Jerusalem. Because in the temple in Jerusalem, you had to select how many Kohanim, how many priests would be involved in the daily service. Not every single one who was there was able to participate. There wasn't enough for everybody to do. So therefore, they would pick, every day they would pick them. How did they pick them? They picked them through a lottery because they didn't want to count them directly. So what would they do? They would gather all the Kohanim. They would all stand in a semicircle. This is all described by Maimonides. And the person who was in charge would take the hat off one of them. Okay? And he would give him back his hat. And then that's how they knew where they would start from. And they would all stand in a circle, and he would say, okay, everybody put out your fingers, and they would put out 1 finger, 2 fingers, 3 fingers, however many fingers they want. And then the Kohen would say, okay, today's number is 25. And they would count 1, 2, 3, 4, and they would count all the fingers. And then whatever finger they got up to, then you were picked. Okay, so let's say today's number was 25. So once they got to the number 25, okay, you're it. Until they got to the amount, and they would continue counting until they got to the amount of Kohanim that they needed for that day's service. And that's how they would pick them. That's actually how they did it once. They used to actually have it kind of a system where it was everybody would just run and grab everything until someone broke his leg, and that's when they started the system of the lottery. So we see that's how they did it in the temple. So how do you do it when it comes to a minyan? When you want to know how many Jews there are. So there's a book called Sefer HaPardes, where Rashi is quoted in that book. I'm not sure if he wrote in that book. He wrote the book. I didn't research before. I didn't have a chance to research it, but he writes in that book or he's quoted in that book. Rashi, a great commentator on the Torah from the 11th or 12th century, around that time, he says that when there are 10, you want to know if there are 10 people, you should recite the verse Vani Berov Chazdecha. The verse Vani Berov Chazdecha has 10 words in it, and I'll read the verse in English. It says, "And I, through your abundant kindness, come into your house. I bow toward your holy sanctuary in awe of you." So that verse clearly references prayer. It's in the prayer services. We say it in the beginning of the morning prayers every day, and other places as well. So Rashi says, you want to know how many Jewish people are. You take a verse, it has 10 words in it, and you count. Okay, you're Vani, you're Beroiv, you're Chazdecha, right? Until once you have Bir Asecha, the last word of the verse, you have a minyan. Now, if you go to a much more contemporary book, there's a book written by Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried called the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the concise or the abridged code of Jewish law. He was I believe a 19th century figure who wrote a lot of commentaries on Jewish law, including his own abridged code. And he says the verse that you use, that is the custom nowadays, is Hoshea Samecha. The verse, grant your salvation to your people and bless your heritage, tend them and exalt them forever. And this verse refers to the Jewish people being saved and salvation. And he says to use this verse, which also has 10 words in it. So you say, again, you go around the synagogue, and if you only have ad, you don't have a minyan. Once Ha'olam walks in, Mr. Ha'olam, he saves the day, and you can start prayer services hopefully before the time that was scheduled. And the question is, why did it become the custom to use this verse, Hoshea Samecha, when we know we have this much more ancient source that quotes using the verse Vani Beroiv Chazdecha, which refers to prayer, of being in awe in the house, in God's house, in the house of prayer, versus using the verse Hoshea Samecha, which refers to salvation. So the Rabbi explains that an amazing thing, that now that we are close to the era of redemption, it became the Jewish custom, and it's recorded in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, that we are closer to the era of Mashiach. Therefore, we use a verse that references Mashiach, references salvation, because we want Mashiach to come, maybe speedily, in our days. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and God willing, we will see you next week. Have a good Shabbos.